Rosalind Arendt sat in a moving carriage bound for the Verdun Empire, watching the border markers of her homeland disappear behind a line of frost-covered pines. 2 days earlier she had lost consciousness during a diplomatic dinner, struck by a fever no physician could explain. When she woke, memories that did not belong to a princess filled her mind. She remembered a desk covered in fragile manuscripts, a university office with her name printed as Hannah Seo, and a novel she had spent 3 years cataloging footnotes for as part of an academic project on invented prophecy narratives. She remembered that the world outside her carriage window was that novel, and that she was standing inside the body of a character who died in its 4th chapter. She recalled the shape of the tragedy without needing to strain for it. Emperor Cale Verdun would marry Saintess Celestine Aaron under the command of a sacred prophecy. 15 years later, a girl called the Black Moon Villainess would murder Cale, burn the imperial capital to ash, and be cut down by the novel's heroine in the ruins of the throne room. Rosalind, the political hostage sent from a defeated kingdom, existed in the story only long enough to die during a failed escape attempt her own family arranged out of shame at having a captured daughter. She pressed her palm against the carriage window and let the information settle instead of panicking. Hannah Seo had spent her career learning to trust primary sources over dramatic conclusions, and she treated her own memory the same way now. The escape attempt was recorded as happening within the first month of her captivity, orchestrated by an uncle who believed a dead princess was less politically damaging than a living hostage. If the novel's timeline held, she had perhaps 3 weeks before her own family tried to have her killed on the road and blamed the Empire for it. Rosalind arrived at the outer gates of the imperial palace to a reception organized entirely for appearances. Duke Lucan Verdun, the emperor's uncle and commander of the imperial army, greeted her with formal courtesy that did not reach his eyes. He explained that she would be housed in the Eastern Hostage Wing under standard guard until the terms of the border treaty were finalized. Rosalind thanked him, catalogued the number of soldiers stationed at each visible checkpoint, and said nothing about what she already knew was coming. She requested an audience with Emperor Cale Verdun the following morning, a request most hostages were denied for weeks. Marquise del Varon, the noblewoman assigned to supervise her, warned her plainly that the Emperor did not grant private meetings to foreign hostages and that the request would likely be read as either naivety or provocation. Rosalind answered that she understood both risks and asked Estelle to submit it anyway, framing it as information relevant to the Empire's security rather than a personal appeal. The audience was granted 2 days later, held in a private study rather than the throne room. Cale Verdun sat behind a heavy desk covered in unread correspondence, 27 years old, and carrying himself with the stillness of a man who had survived more assassination attempts than diplomatic dinners. He did not rise when Rosalind entered, and he did not offer her a chair. He asked her directly why a hostage princess believed she had information worth his time. Rosalind told him that her family intended to stage her death during a prisoner transfer scheduled for later in the month, using a route through the Kessler Pass that her uncle had already selected. She explained that the attackers would be dressed as imperial bandits to make the Empire appear responsible, giving Arendt grounds to break the treaty and rally sympathy from neighboring kingdoms. She did not tell him how she knew. When he asked, she said only that she had learned to read her family's patterns of correspondence long before she was sent here, and that a hostage with nothing left to lose from her own household had every reason to protect herself by any means available. Cale studied her for a long moment before responding. He told her that intelligence without a credible source was worth exactly nothing, and that a foreign princess inventing a conspiracy to secure better treatment inside his palace would not be the first attempt of its kind. Rosalind did not argue the accusation. She said that he could verify the claim by quietly reassigning the guard rotation on the Kessler Pass route and watching who reacted, and that if she was lying, he had lost nothing but a week of extra caution. If she was telling the truth, he would have proof his hostage was being used as a pretext for war before the war began. He agreed to the arrangement without promising her protection in return. Over the following 10 days, palace scouts confirmed unusual movement near the Kessler Pass consistent with an ambush being prepared, and the transfer order was quietly cancelled. Cale did not summon Rosalind to thank her. Instead, he ordered her moved from the hostage wing into a guarded residence closer to the central palace, officially explained as a security upgrade following the discovered threat, and privately understood by his staff as the Emperor keeping a dangerous asset within reach. Rosalind used the relocation to begin learning the palace's actual political shape rather than the version presented at formal functions. Estelle, no longer treating her only as an assignment, mentioned in passing that the temple was expected to announce Kale's engagement to Saintess Celestine Aaron within 3 months, and that the match had been described publicly as the fulfillment of a sacred prophecy protecting the Empire's future. Rosalind asked what the prophecy actually said. Estelle admitted she had never read the full text herself, since only temple-certified nobility were permitted to view the original document, and that most of the court simply repeated what Grand Oracle Severian's public statements claimed it contained. Rosalind recognized the gap immediately. A prophecy that shaped imperial succession, and no one outside the temple had verified firsthand, was exactly the kind of document Hannah Seo had spent her career learning to distrust. She did not yet know how the marriage connected to the villainess who would one day kill Kale and destroy his empire, but she understood that stopping a wedding without understanding its foundation would accomplish nothing if the underlying prophecy simply produced the same tragedy through another path. That evening, alone in her new quarters, Rosalind set aside the plan she had originally intended, which was to quietly gather information and wait for a safer opportunity to interfere. She had 3 weeks of goodwill purchased by exposing her own family, an emperor who now knew she was useful, and a wedding date that would become far harder to stop once it was formally announced before the entire court. Waiting quietly was a plan that belonged to someone who still had the luxury of time. She decided that at the next imperial function large enough to make her words impossible to quietly bury, she would force the succession question into the open herself, whatever it cost her standing in a palace that did not yet trust her. The imperial banquet marking the formal close of the border negotiations filled the verdant Great Hall with nearly every noble family attached to the throne. Rosalind stood near the edge of the room in a gown chosen by Estelle to signal restrained dignity rather than provocation, watching Kale receive a slow procession of ministers offering congratulations for a war he had not personally fought. Duke Lucan stood near the dais, and Estelle remained close to Rosalind's side, unaware that the evening's script had already changed. When a pause opened between formal toasts, Rosalind stepped forward before any usher could stop her, and addressed the hall directly. She stated her name, her title, and her intention plainly. She had come to the Verdant Empire as a hostage, but she wished to be considered instead as a suitor, and she intended to court and marry Emperor Kale Verdant. The hall went quiet in the particular way large rooms go quiet when several hundred people simultaneously decide not to be the first to react. Kale's expression did not change, though the pause before he answered lasted long enough for the silence to become its own kind of statement. He told her, in a voice pitched to carry to the back of the hall, that the Empire did not select its consorts through public declarations made by hostages, and that he had no intention of marrying a princess whose kingdom had lost a war to his. He added that he would discuss the matter with her once, privately, and that she would not raise it publicly again. The rejection was clean enough that most of the court read it as the end of the incident, and conversation resumed within minutes. Duke Lucan found Rosalind near a side terrace after the banquet had thinned and told her without much diplomacy that she had likely ended any chance of favorable treatment for her kingdom. Estelle said nothing until they were alone in the corridor, then asked Rosalind directly whether she understood what she had just done in front of every noble family capable of spreading the story by morning. Rosalind answered that she understood exactly what she had done, and that a private, forgettable request would never have moved fast enough against a wedding already 3 months from its announcement. Kale summoned her the next morning, earlier than protocol required, and this time he did offer her a chair. He asked her plainly how a foreign hostage, newly arrived and without access to temple records, had learned that his marriage to Celestine Aaron was already decided. The engagement had not been publicly announced. Rosalind had referenced a wedding that, officially, did not yet exist. She told him again that she had prophetic dreams, the same explanation she had used to avoid revealing the truth about her memory, and that she had seen fragments of a marriage tied to a sacred prophecy without understanding its full shape. Cale did not accept the explanation, but he also did not dismiss it outright. He told her that dreams were not admissible as intelligence, and that if she wanted him to take her seriously, she would need to produce something a rational court could examine. Rosalind asked whether she could be granted supervised access to the ceremonial copy of the prophecy kept for public temple ceremonies, arguing that if her claim was false, comparing it against the actual document would prove that immediately. Cale studied her for a long moment before agreeing, on the condition that Sir Theo Marin, his personal knight, remain present for the entire viewing. 2 days later, Rosalind was escorted into a temple annex used for ceremonial displays rather than the restricted archive itself. The ceremonial copy of the prophecy hung inside a sealed glass case, written in formal temple script and dated to the founding century of the Verdun dynasty. Theo stood near the door, arms folded, clearly expecting nothing useful to come from the visit. Rosalind examined the visible text first, reading through the sanctioned wording about a union that would secure the empire's future, before turning her attention to the physical construction of the page itself. She noticed what a court noble untrained in manuscript work would have missed. The parchment carried a faint discoloration along one edge of the central paragraph, a difference in ink density inconsistent with the rest of the document, and spacing between 2 lines that did not match the deliberate formatting used everywhere else on the page. She had spent years identifying exactly this kind of alteration in disputed legal contracts, and every visible sign pointed to the same conclusion. An entire clause had been removed from the prophecy after its original composition, and the remaining text had been carefully reset to disguise the gap. Rosalind did not announce her conclusion to Theo. She asked instead, in a tone deliberately casual, whether the temple had ever restored or recopied the ceremonial display, since parchment degraded faster in humid display cases than in sealed archives. Theo answered that as far as he knew, the display had never been touched since its installation, which meant the inconsistency she had found was not the result of routine preservation work. She thanked him for his patience and left without pressing further, aware that revealing too much interest too quickly would only draw temple attention toward her before she had anything concrete to bring to Cale. She reported her findings to Cale that evening, describing the physical evidence of tampering without claiming to know what the missing clause had said. Cale's reaction was harder to read than she expected. He did not accuse her of fabricating the claim, and he did not immediately accept it either. He told her that if she was right, someone with access to a sealed temple archive had altered a document his family had trusted for generations to justify his own marriage, and that such an accusation could not be raised without absolute proof. He ordered her moved once again, this time into a guarded residence directly inside the central palace wing, officially framed as continued protection for a hostage who had uncovered a threat, and privately understood by both of them as Cale keeping her close enough to watch while he decided whether to trust her. Rosalind accepted the new arrangement without complaint, recognizing that proximity to Cale was worth more to her plan than comfort or independence. Over the following weeks, she built a routine that gave her legitimate reason to remain near him, joining supervised sessions in the Imperial Archive under the excuse of researching a Renverdun Treaty precedent, attending political briefings Estelle arranged for her as part of hostage protocol, and appearing at minor court ceremonies where her presence beside the Emperor drew exactly the kind of attention she wanted. Cale tolerated the arrangement with visible reluctance, correcting her manners during formal briefings and refusing, without exception, every exaggerated marriage proposal she offered him in private as a running joke neither of them fully treated as a joke. 3 weeks into her residence in the central palace wing, Rosalind learned that Cale was scheduled to attend the Founding Day Rite, an annual temple ceremony requiring the emperor to renew a set of ancestral oaths before the assembled court. Estelle explained the ceremony as a formality repeated every year without incident, but Rosalind asked to see the written text of the oath in advance, citing her ongoing archive research as justification. Cale allowed it, more out of habit than expectation, and had a temple clerk deliver a copy to her rooms 2 days before the rite. Rosalind read the oath the same way she had read the prophecy, checking the physical construction of the document rather than trusting its content at face value. She found a clause near the end binding the emperor to accept the temple's counsel in matters of succession, worded broadly enough to cover almost any future decision the temple wished to influence, including, she suspected, his eventual marriage. The surrounding oath language matched previous years' recorded wording exactly, which meant the clause had likely been inserted gradually over several ceremonies rather than added all at once, each version slightly broader than the last. She brought the comparison to Kale the morning of the ceremony, laying two versions of the oath side by side and showing him precisely which phrases had shifted since the earliest surviving copy in the archive. Kale read the comparison twice before speaking. He told her that breaking from the ceremony publicly, without explanation, would create exactly the kind of instability the temple could use against him, but that swearing an oath binding his own succession without understanding its full weight was equally unacceptable. He asked her, directly, what she would do in his position. Rosalind suggested he request a ceremonial delay on the grounds of reviewing archival precedent before renewing any binding oath, framing the request as diligence rather than defiance. Kale used almost exactly that framing before the assembled court that afternoon, citing his duty to honor the exact original wording of his family's oaths rather than an evolving version, and requesting time for the temple to produce the earliest surviving text for comparison. Grand Oracle Severin, presiding over the rite, agreed with visible calm, though Rosalind noticed his attention shift toward her position near the dais before the ceremony concluded. Severin approached her directly for the first time that evening, finding her alone in a palace corridor on her way back from the archive. He introduced himself with practiced warmth and told her that he had heard of her diligent interest in temple history, adding that such curiosity was a credit to her intelligence, provided it did not extend into matters reserved for those with proper spiritual training. Rosalind answered that she had no interest in doctrine, only in accuracy, and that any historian would want to compare an old document against its earliest version before accepting a newer one as authoritative. Severian's expression did not change, but he told her, before continuing down the corridor, that history sometimes required careful handling by those who understood its purpose rather than only its wording. 2 days later, Saintess Celestine Aron arrived at the imperial palace to formally begin preparations for her role in the upcoming succession rites, though the marriage itself had still not been publicly announced. Her arrival was staged with full temple ceremony, Severin himself escorting her through the central courtyard while nobles gathered to observe. Rosalind watched from the edge of the crowd, recognizing the saintess immediately from fragments of the novel she remembered, and feeling the weight of a name she had expected to eventually confront in person. Celestine moved through the reception with practiced composure, exchanging measured pleasantries with Duke Lucan and accepting Severian's guidance at every turn with visible deference. Rosalind read the display as confirmation of what the novel had implied, a saintess groomed by the temple, aligned with Severian's authority, and positioned to become the mother of the child who would one day destroy the empire. She kept her distance during the reception, offering only a formal greeting when introductions were unavoidable, and told Estelle afterward that she intended to treat Celestine as the primary obstacle standing between the empire and the future she was trying to prevent. Kale's own reaction to Celestine's arrival was harder for Rosalind to interpret. He greeted the saintess with the same controlled courtesy he extended to every court formality, offering no warmth beyond what protocol required, but he also did not seek Rosalind out afterward the way he had during the previous weeks. Rosalind told herself the distance was strategic necessity rather than genuine interest, though she noted, without examining the feeling too closely, that watching Celestine stand beside him in official ceremony bothered her more than she had expected. 4 nights after the reception, Rosalind found a folded note left inside her private study, unsigned and delivered by no servant she could identify. It requested a meeting in the palace's eastern garden after midnight, in a section rarely patrolled due to its distance from the main residence wings. She considered ignoring it, aware of how easily such a request could be a trap arranged by the temple, but the handwriting matched official correspondence she had seen from Celestine's own attendants, and curiosity about the saintess's real position outweighed her caution. Celestine was waiting alone when Rosalind arrived, dressed in a plain traveling cloak rather than temple ceremonial dress. She spoke quickly and quietly, telling Rosalind that her rooms were being monitored by temple observers reporting directly to Severian, and that anything she said or wrote inside the central palace wing should be assumed to reach him within a day. Rosalind asked why Celestine was warning a woman who had publicly declared intention to marry the man Celestine was set to marry herself. Celestine answered that she had her own reasons for wanting Severian's authority questioned, though she was not yet willing to explain what those reasons were, and that she would rather have Rosalind as a cautious ally than an enemy acting on incomplete assumptions. She left the garden before Rosalind could press further, leaving behind a warning that did not fit the role Rosalind had already assigned her. A merchant caravan carrying approved trade correspondence between Orient and the Verdant Empire arrived at the palace gates the following week, and buried inside a shipment of dyed wool samples addressed to Estelle's household, Rosalind found a letter written in her mother's private cipher. Queen Marcella's message was brief and direct. She acknowledged the rumors reaching Orient about Rosalind's public pursuit of the Emperor, called the strategy reckless but potentially useful, and instructed Rosalind to use whatever access she had gained to copy troop deployment records along the shared border, particularly regarding garrison strength at the Kessler Pass Rosalind had already exposed once before. Rosalind read the letter twice before burning it in her private hearth, weighing the danger of ignoring her mother against the danger of complying. Refusing outright risked her family concluding she had turned fully against Orient, which could prompt a more direct attempt to remove her, either through another staged accident or by pressuring the temple to have her hostage status revoked entirely. She decided her safest path was to appear cooperative without providing anything genuinely damaging, and began drafting a response describing garrison numbers already published in prior treaty negotiations, information technically accurate but militarily useless to anyone planning an offensive. A second letter arrived 9 days later, this one carried by a merchant she recognized as one of her brother Adrian's personal contacts rather than the household's usual courier. Adrian's portion of the message was shorter than their mother's, written with visible discomfort even through the cipher. He told her that their mother's patience was thinning, that the council at home viewed her lack of useful intelligence as a sign she had genuinely switched loyalties, and that he could not protect her standing at home much longer if she continued providing nothing of value. He did not tell her to disobey their mother, and he did not tell her to comply either, which Rosalind recognized as exactly the kind of careful neutrality that had defined her brother's choices for as long as she could remember. Rosalind wrote back to Adrian directly, asking him plainly whether he understood what their mother was actually asking of her, given that any real military intelligence handed to Orient could be used to justify renewed conflict with an empire that had already defeated them once. Adrian's reply came slower than usual and offered no reassurance, only a repeated warning that their mother would not wait indefinitely, and a request that Rosalind manage the situation, without further explanation of what management should look like. Rosalind understood the message for what it was: her brother would not stop their mother, and he would not help her either, unless the cost of standing beside their mother eventually became too high even for him. 3 weeks passed without further contact, during which Rosalind continued her research routine with Kale, comparing additional temple ceremony records against archived originals and finding 2 more instances of clauses added gradually over successive years. Kale had begun, without formally acknowledging it, treating her conclusions as reliable enough to act on quietly, adjusting minor ceremonial language during a minor blessing rite without public explanation. Their private exchanges during these sessions had settled into an unspoken rhythm, Rosalind offering commentary sharp enough to make him pause before responding, Kale answering her proposals with the same flat refusal each time, though the refusal had begun arriving with less edge in it than before. The final letter from Orient arrived hidden inside a small lacquered box delivered alongside a formal diplomatic gift meant for the imperial household. Rosalind discovered the false bottom by instinct, having handled enough historical smuggling cases in her previous life to recognize the construction, and found a small glass vial packed in wax alongside a note in her mother's hand. The note was shorter than the others and considerably more direct. It stated that continued negotiation had failed to produce any advantage for Orient, that the Emperor's death during a period of instability could be blamed convincingly on temple factions already resisting his reforms, and that Rosalind was to administer the vial's contents to Kale at the earliest safe opportunity. Rosalind sat with the vial for the better part of a night before deciding what to do with it. She considered destroying it quietly and continuing to stall her mother with vague excuses, a path that protected her from immediate suspicion but left the actual danger unaddressed, since her mother would simply try again through another method if this attempt produced no results. She considered keeping it as leverage against her own family, a path Hanasio's training toward primary evidence made distasteful even as a hostage's daughter. By morning she had chosen the option that offered no protection for herself at all. She requested an audience with Kale and brought the vial and the letter with her, placing both on his desk without preamble. She told him plainly what her mother had sent, what it was instructed to do, and why she had chosen to bring it to him instead of using it, discarding it, or reporting back to Arendt that the attempt had failed through some invented obstacle. Kale examined the vial in silence for a long moment before asking her directly why a princess with every reason to want him weakened, married to a rival saintess, or dead, would instead hand him proof that her own mother wanted him poisoned. Rosalind answered that her survival no longer depended on her family's success, since Arendt had already shown it was willing to treat her as expendable in either outcome, exposed or unexposed. She told him that whatever her original reasons for pursuing him had been, she was not willing to build her future on his death, and that continuing to protect her family's secret, while doing nothing would have made her complicit in whatever happened next. Kale did not answer immediately. He set the vial aside, ordered it sent to his physicians for analysis, and told her, without softening the observation, that he still could not fully separate her genuine feelings from a hostage's calculated survival instinct, and that handing him evidence against her own mother did not resolve that uncertainty so much as complicate it further. He increased her formal standing at court within the week regardless, elevating her from guarded hostage to recognized political guest with expanded freedom of movement inside the palace, a change that drew immediate notice from the nobility and renewed murmurs about the emperor's unusual patience with the errant princess. Rosalind understood the gesture as trust extended cautiously rather than trust fully given, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the distinction mattered to her far more than it should have if her pursuit of him had remained purely strategic. Word of the poisoning attempt did not reach the wider court, but it reached Duke Lucan, who began watching Rosalind with an attention considerably less hostile than before, and it reached Severien, whose sources within the palace ensured that very little escaped his notice for long. Her expanded freedom of movement gave Rosalind access to sections of the Imperial Archive previously closed to hostages, and she used the privilege to pursue a question that had been forming since her first examination of the ceremonial prophecy. If the temple had altered a document to secure Kale's marriage, what else in the archive's official record might have been quietly rewritten? She began cross-referencing temple ceremony logs against the palace's own household records, searching for the same signs of inconsistent ink and reset spacing she had already learned to recognize. A young temple scholar named Brother Elias approached her privately during one of these sessions, having noticed her methodical comparisons over several visits. He introduced himself carefully, explaining that he worked as a junior archivist within the temple's own record division, and that he had grown increasingly troubled over the past year by discrepancies in documents Grand Oracle Severien had personally ordered destroyed and replaced. He told her he had begun secretly preserving copies before the originals were removed, unsure what to do with them, and that her open interest in temple record-keeping had convinced him she might be someone willing to look at what he had found. Elias produced a small collection of preserved fragments, among them a monastery admittance record dated 6 years earlier, shortly after the accident that had killed Kale's older brother and sister-in-law. The record listed a single child received into temple custody under a sealed designation, with no name recorded in the copy available to General Archive staff. Elias explained that the original, unsealed version had been among the documents Severien ordered destroyed, but that he had managed to transcribe the child's true name before the original disappeared. He had not understood its significance until seeing Rosalind's research into the imperial succession line. Rosalind read the name Elias had transcribed and felt the ground shift under a plan she had built on the assumption that the future villainess did not yet exist inside the palace. The child's name was Muriel. She recognized it immediately from the novel's opening chapters, where the Black Moon villainess was introduced under that same name, described as a girl whose corrupted power would one day bring down the Empire from within its own walls. Rosalind had spent months assuming Celestine would eventually bear a daughter who grew into that role. She had never considered that the villainess might already be alive, hidden inside a monastery under temple control since before Rosalind had even arrived in the Empire. She brought Elias directly to Cale that same evening, presenting the transcribed record without softening what it implied. Cale read the document in silence longer than he had spent on any single page since Rosalind had begun bringing him evidence of temple tampering. He asked Elias, in a voice carefully controlled, whether the child in the record could be his brother's daughter, the niece officially recorded as having died alongside her parents in the accident 6 years earlier. Elias answered that he could not be certain without further records, but that the timing, the sealed designation, and the deliberate destruction of the original document all pointed toward exactly that conclusion. Rosalind watched something in Cale break its careful composure for the first time since she had known him. He set the record down with more force than the moment required and asked, to no one in particular, how a child could be hidden inside temple custody for 6 years without a single report reaching the palace, and how he had failed to demand proof of his own niece's death thoroughly enough to notice the gap. Rosalind told him plainly that grief following the sudden death of a brother rarely left room for the kind of forensic doubt she had spent years training for, and that the fault belonged to whoever had falsified the death record, not to a man mourning his family. Cale did not accept the reassurance easily. He told her that he had ordered an investigation into his brother's death at the time, one that Severian himself had assured him was thorough, and that he had trusted the temple's account without demanding the kind of physical evidence Rosalind had taught him to distrust in every other document since. He asked her directly whether she believed Muriel's survival meant Severian had also arranged his brother's death rather than simply covering up its aftermath. Rosalind admitted she could not yet prove intent, but that a temple willing to fake a child's death and conceal her for 6 years had clearly benefited from the accident in ways that made the original explanation worth questioning entirely. Elias, still present, added quietly that he had found one further detail in the fragments he preserved before they were destroyed. The monastery designated for the child's custody had a documented history of housing individuals undergoing what temple records vaguely described as corrective spiritual instruction, a term he had never seen applied to an infant before. He did not know what the instruction involved, only that the same monastery appeared in several other sealed records he had not yet had time to fully examine. Cale ordered him to bring every remaining fragment directly to the palace under guard, rather than risk further destruction inside the temple's own archive. Rosalind spent that night turning over what she now understood about the shape of the tragedy she had come here to prevent. The novel had never explained why the Black Moon villainess turned against the empire that raised her, only that she had. If Muriel had spent 6 years inside a monastery under Severian's control, subjected to some form of instruction Elias could not yet describe, the villainess's eventual betrayal began to look less like an inevitable fate and more like the direct result of exactly the kind of manipulation Rosalind had already uncovered in the marriage prophecy and the succession oaths. Preventing Cale's wedding to Celestine, she realized, would do nothing to stop a tragedy whose true cause was a child already suffering inside temple custody, 6 years before Rosalind had ever set foot in the Empire. She found Cale still awake in his study near midnight, staring at the monastery record as though rereading it might change what it said. She told him what she had concluded, that stopping his marriage had never been enough to prevent the future she remembered, because the true danger was not a wedding but whatever the temple had already done, and was still doing, to a child he did not yet know was alive. Cale asked her, quietly, what she believed needed to happen next. Rosalind answered that they needed to find Muriel before Severian learned how much they already knew, and that whatever came after would depend entirely on what condition they found her in. Rosalind sought out Celestine the next morning, aware that locating a single sealed monastery among dozens scattered across temple-held territory would require knowledge she did not have. She found the saintess in her private chapel and told her plainly what Elias had uncovered, admitting without excuse that she had spent months treating Celestine as an enemy aligned with Severien rather than asking what the saintess actually wanted for herself. Celestine listened without interrupting, then told Rosalind that she had already suspected the temple was hiding something inside its custodial monasteries, having noticed several saintesses assigned to those postings never returned to public duty, and that she would help locate the child on the condition that her own involvement remained hidden from Severien for as long as possible. Celestine identified the monastery from the description Elias had preserved, a remote custodial house in the northern hills officially designated for housing orphaned children with unstable magical potential, rarely visited by anyone outside temple staff. She warned that the posting existed specifically to keep such children isolated from public record, and that whatever methods the temple used to manage unstable magic there had never been reviewed by anyone outside Severien's inner circle. Kale, once informed, ordered a visit framed as a routine imperial inspection of temple-run custodial institutions, a pretext broad enough to justify his presence without immediately signaling that he suspected his niece was inside. The group that traveled north 5 days later included Kale, Rosalind, Celestine, Theo, and Elias, deliberately kept small to avoid drawing temple attention before they had confirmed what they were dealing with. The monastery itself was a plain stone building surrounded by high walls, its administering priests visibly unsettled by an unannounced imperial inspection but unable to refuse the emperor's authority outright. Kale requested a full accounting of every child currently housed there, watching the presiding priest's composure falter slightly when he reached the entry for a girl recorded only under a numbered designation rather than a name. Theo located the child's quarters at the rear of the building, a small stone room with a single barred window and furnishings sparse enough to suggest confinement rather than care. Muriel was seated on the floor when they entered, 7 years old, thin, and immediately alert to the presence of strangers in a way that suggested she had learned to expect danger from unfamiliar visitors. She did not cry out or retreat, only watched them with the flat, careful attention of someone who had already decided that showing fear invited worse treatment. Kale stepped forward first, and the moment he did, Muriel's composure broke into open panic. She scrambled back against the far wall and told him, in a voice too controlled for a child her age, that she had done nothing wrong and that she would not use her power again if he let her stay in the room instead of sending her further inside. Kale stopped immediately, visibly startled by the specific fear directed at him personally rather than at armed strangers in general. He asked her, as gently as his unfamiliarity with children allowed, why she believed he intended to punish her. Muriel answered that the priest had always told her the emperor was the one who ordered her kept here, away from a family that considered her too dangerous to be seen. Rosalind recognized immediately that pressing Kale's identity further would only deepen the child's fear, and stepped between them before he could try to correct the misunderstanding directly. She knelt at a distance Muriel's own body language suggested was tolerable, and told her plainly that no one in the room intended to make her use her power for anything, and that she was welcome to keep both hands folded in her lap for the entire visit if that was what felt safest. Muriel studied her for a long moment before asking, warily, whether that was a trick, since the priests always claimed the same thing before testing her anyway. Rosalind answered that she understood why Muriel would assume that, and that she did not expect to be believed after one sentence, only to prove it by actually leaving her alone about it. The presiding priest, still hovering near the doorway, attempted to explain that the child's power required regular supervised release to prevent dangerous buildup, using language that echoed almost exactly the temple's public claims about lunar magic's instability. Kale, recovering his composure, ordered the priest to describe precisely what supervised release involved, and the increasingly evasive answers that followed made clear that the process included physical restraint and prolonged isolation whenever Muriel's magic responded to fear or distress rather than deliberate use. Celestine, listening with visible tension, told Kale quietly that she recognized the described method from temple medical texts restricted to senior clergy, and that it had never been intended for use on a child. Elias, examining a ledger left open on a nearby table, found daily records tracking Muriel's magical episodes alongside notes on her physical condition, confirming a pattern of punishment triggered whenever her power surfaced under stress rather than during any structured training. Rosalind read enough of the entries to understand that 6 years of this treatment had taught Muriel to associate her own magic with pain and abandonment, and that whatever the temple intended to eventually do with that corrupted power, they had spent years deliberately cultivating the exact instability they claimed to be managing. Cale did not confront the priest further in front of the child, choosing instead to keep his questions measured until Muriel was no longer required to witness them. He told Muriel only that he had not known she was here until a few days earlier, and that he intended to make sure the priests never restrained her again, though he did not yet ask her to trust that promise. Muriel did not answer, watching him with the same guarded stillness she had shown since they entered, though Rosalind noticed she had stopped pressing herself quite as tightly against the wall by the time they finally left the room to discuss what came next away from her hearing. Cale made his decision before the group had finished the ride back to the palace outskirts. He told Rosalind and the others that he would not wait for a quiet, deniable extraction that risked Severien moving Muriel to a second, better hidden location before he could act. Instead, he intended to invoke his authority directly, citing the ledger Elias had recovered as documented evidence of abuse within a temple-run institution, and order Muriel's immediate transfer into imperial custody under law that predated the temple's control over custodial monasteries. Theo warned him plainly that issuing a formal writ would notify the temple within hours that the emperor had found the child and understood what had been done to her. Cale answered that he had already accepted that cost the moment he chose not to let his niece remain another night inside that room. The formal transfer arrived at the monastery 2 days later, carried by an armed imperial escort under Theo's command, presenting the priests with a legal order neither they nor any message from the capital could override in time. The presiding priest protested that the child required specialized care only the temple could provide, an argument Theo dismissed by reading aloud the exact ledger entries documenting the supervised release methods used on her, entries the priest could not credibly deny having authorized. Muriel was brought out of the monastery within the hour, wrapped in a traveling cloak too large for her, watching the soldiers around her with the same wary stillness she had shown during the first visit, though this time she did not resist being led toward the waiting carriage. Word reached Severien by the following morning, delivered by temple contacts inside the Imperial Guard who had witnessed the transfer order pass through official channels. He did not attempt to intercept the carriage or contest the writ publicly, recognizing correctly that any open confrontation before he understood exactly what Cale knew would only expose more of his own involvement. Instead, he began quietly recalling the priests who had overseen Muriel's confinement to a separate temple holding, ensuring their testimony would not surface uncontrolled, and sent word to Duke Lucan requesting an urgent private audience regarding what he called concerning developments in the Emperor's judgment. Muriel arrived at the imperial palace exhausted and largely silent, submitting to a physician's examination only after Rosalind sat with her through the entire process and repeated, each time the physician reached for an instrument, exactly what he intended to do before he did it. The examination confirmed what the ledger had already suggested: signs of prolonged malnourishment, old injuries consistent with repeated physical restraint, and a nervous system the physician described as unusually reactive to sudden movement or raised voices. Cale received the report in person, reading it standing rather than seated, and left the room without speaking to anyone for nearly an hour afterward. Duke Lucan raised the political question Cale had been avoiding within the same day Muriel's presence in the palace became impossible to keep quiet. He told Cale plainly that housing an unstable magical child inside the imperial residence without a formal legal status would leave her vulnerable to exactly the kind of temple reclaiming Severien was already maneuvering toward, since as an unclaimed ward of uncertain parentage, her custody remained legally contestable. Lucan did not oppose protecting her, but he pressed Cale to consider what protection actually required under imperial law, rather than relying on goodwill the temple had already shown it did not share. Cale called a full council session 3 days after Muriel's arrival and announced, before ministers who had not been given advance warning, that he was formally recognizing Muriel as his daughter and legal heir, citing her status as his brother's only surviving child and his duty to protect the last remaining member of his immediate family line. The announcement produced immediate protest from several conservative ministers who questioned the legitimacy of an adoption conducted without temple ceremony, and quieter alarm from others who understood that naming an unstable magical child as heir carried risks Kale was choosing to accept publicly rather than manage privately. Kale answered every objection with the same flat certainty he had used to refuse Rosalind's proposals for months, stating that the temple's custody of his niece had already proven itself unfit, and that no ceremony was required to make her his daughter when the fact of her birth already had. Rosalind stood near the back of the council chamber during the announcement, watching Muriel's name formally entered into the imperial succession record for the first time, and felt something cold settle beneath the relief she should have been allowed to feel without complication. She remembered, with a clarity that made the chamber's noise fade around her, the opening line of the novel's 3rd chapter, the sentence that had introduced the Black Moon villainess to its readers. The prophecy named her only as the Emperor's daughter, long before anyone learned her given name. Kale had just made that phrase literally true, in full view of his entire court, in the act of saving her. She did not say anything to Kale that evening, watching him sit beside Muriel's new quarters long after the child had fallen asleep, clearly unwilling to leave her alone on her first night inside the palace. Rosalind told herself she needed time to think before raising a fear that had no solution attached to it yet, that accusing Kale of having made a mistake in the same breath as praising him for rescuing his niece would help no one, least of all a child who had just been given, for the first time in 6 years, an adult who refused to leave her side. But privately, alone in her own rooms afterward, Rosalind understood that saving Muriel from the temple's cruelty had not moved them further from the tragedy she remembered. It had moved them one step closer to it, and she no longer knew whether preventing what came next was still possible at all. Muriel's first weeks inside the palace produced small, uneven progress rather than any sudden transformation. She continued flinching at raised voices and unfamiliar footsteps, but she had begun accepting meals brought to her directly by Rosalind rather than only from palace servants, and she had stopped asking, each time Rosalind entered the room, whether she was there to test anything. Kale visited daily, sitting nearby without demanding conversation, and Muriel had started tolerating his presence even when she still would not meet his eyes for long. Rosalind kept her earlier promise scrupulously, never once asking Muriel to demonstrate or suppress her magic, and treated every small sign of the child relaxing as proof the approach was working rather than as something to rush. The incident occurred during a public ceremony marking the anniversary of the empire's founding, held in the central plaza before a crowd of thousands and requiring the entire imperial household's attendance, including Muriel's, since her formal recognition as Kale's daughter made her absence politically conspicuous. Rosalind stayed close to her throughout the ceremony, watching the crowd rather than the proceedings, uneasy at the number of strangers pressed near the dais. Partway through the emperor's address, a temple attendant Rosalind did not recognize moved through the crowd close enough to Muriel's position to startle her badly, and the girl's magic surged outward in a burst of cold light that shattered several nearby lanterns and knocked 2 guards off their feet before Kale could reach her. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Nobles and commoners alike who had only recently learned that the emperor's newly named heir carried unstable magic now had visible proof of exactly what that instability could do in public, and the surge, brief as it was, spread through the city by evening as an account of the emperor's daughter losing control before thousands of witnesses. Elias, investigating quietly afterward, found that the attendant who had approached Muriel's position was not registered among any of the temple staff assigned to the ceremony, and that his movements matched no legitimate duty near the dais. Rosalind understood the implication immediately. Someone had deliberately placed a stranger close enough to frighten a traumatized child into exactly the kind of reaction that would terrify the entire capital. Grand Oracle Severian did not need to fabricate outrage over the incident. He needed only to amplify what had already happened. Within 2 days, temple sermons across the capital referenced the founding ceremony's disruption as a warning sign the temple had tried, in his words, to responsibly manage for years before the emperor removed the child from proper spiritual oversight. He did not accuse Kale directly of endangering the city, framing his statements instead as concerned counsel from a religious authority who understood magical instability better than a grieving uncle acting on impulse. The distinction did not matter to a frightened public. Within a week, petitions began circulating among noble households requesting the emperor reconsider his niece's placement inside the palace. Duke Lucan brought the matter to full council session, no longer arguing only about legal status but about public safety directly. He told Kale that whatever the temple's past failures, a child capable of unintentionally injuring palace guards during a public ceremony could not remain inside the capital's most populated district without risking a far worse incident, and that returning her to specialized temple care, under closer imperial oversight than before, might now be the only politically survivable option. Several ministers who had previously stayed silent on the adoption openly supported the proposal, citing the anniversary incident as proof that good intentions did not override practical danger. Rosalind requested to address the council directly, a request unusual enough for a foreign hostage that several ministers initially objected before Kale overruled them. She presented Elias's findings about the unregistered attendant, laying out precisely how his presence near Muriel's position matched no assigned duty, and how his movements immediately before the incident were consistent with someone deliberately provoking a reaction rather than someone caught accidentally in a crowd. She told the council plainly that the anniversary incident was not evidence of an uncontrollable child, but evidence that the very institution demanding her return had engineered the disaster it was now using to justify reclaiming her. She did not stop at presenting evidence. She told the assembled ministers that returning Muriel to the temple's custody after what the recovered ledger had already documented would mean knowingly delivering an abused child back to the people who had abused her, based on a crisis those same people had staged, and that any minister voting to do so was choosing the temple's convenience over a 7-year-old's safety with full knowledge of what that choice actually meant. The chamber went quiet in a way that mirrored the silence after her banquet declaration months earlier. Though this time the reaction was not scandal but something closer to shame, several ministers visibly unwilling to meet her eyes as she finished speaking. The council did not vote to return Muriel to the temple, though Duke Lucan continued to push for tighter restrictions on where inside the palace she was permitted to appear publicly. Rosalind's speech accomplished exactly what she had intended, but it accomplished something else as well, something she understood only after Estelle quietly informed her that word of her open, formal accusation against the Temple of the Twin Lights had already reached Turin's ambassador, who had reported it home as proof that Rosalind was no longer merely uncooperative but actively working against an institution withstanding across every kingdom on the continent, including her own. Whatever narrow path might once have existed for her eventual return to Orient, quietly rehabilitated as a hostage who had simply misjudged her position, closed the moment those words left her mouth in front of the entire Imperial Council. Rosalind had known, standing at that podium, that speaking would cost her something. She had not expected, until Estelle's message arrived, exactly how completely it had. Kale found her in the archive 3 nights after the council session, working later than usual on records Elias had recovered concerning the temple's custodial monasteries. He did not raise the subject of Orient directly, but he told her he was aware her accusation before the council had likely closed her path home, and that he had not asked her to make that sacrifice on Muriel's behalf. Rosalind answered that he had not needed to ask, and that she had understood exactly what the speech would cost before she gave it. Kale sat down across from her without being invited, an informality he rarely allowed himself, and admitted that he had spent every day since the ceremony trying to determine whether he kept her this close to the investigation because her knowledge remained useful, or because the thought of her returning to Orient, or to any life that did not include him, had become something he could no longer consider without difficulty. Rosalind set down the document she had been reading and told him, with more honesty than she had allowed herself in months, that her pursuit of him had begun exactly as he had always suspected, as a calculated plan to survive a death she believed was already written for her, using whatever leverage a hostage princess could construct out of a stranger's ambition. She told him that somewhere between the archive sessions, the temple investigation, and watching him sit beside Muriel's door on her first frightened night in the palace, the plan had stopped being only a plan. She did not know exactly when it had happened. She only knew that if he asked her now to walk away from the Empire, from Muriel, and from him, she would no longer be able to do it and call it survival. Kale did not answer immediately, and for a moment Rosalind believed the conversation had reached the kind of quiet, mutual understanding neither of them needed to name aloud. Then he asked her the question she had spent months carefully steering around: how a hostage who claimed only fragmented prophetic dreams had produced, over and over, exact knowledge of documents, dates, and secrets no dream should have been able to describe with such precision. He told her he had allowed the explanation to stand because it was convenient, not because he had ever fully believed it, and that after everything they had uncovered together, she owed him the truth rather than another careful half-answer. Rosalind understood, sitting across from him in the quiet archive, that she had finally run out of room to keep the full truth contained. She told him what she had never told anyone in this world, that she had not always been Rosalind Arendt, that before waking inside this body she had lived an entire separate life as a historian who studied exactly the kind of manuscript she now used to expose the temple, and that the empire's future she claimed to glimpse in fragments was in fact a complete story she had read from beginning to end, long before ever setting foot in Britain. She told him the ending directly, without softening it, that in the story she remembered, he married Celestine under the temple's prophecy, and that 15 years from now, the Black Moon villainess murdered him and burned the imperial capital before being killed in turn. Kale sat in silence long enough that Rosalind began to wonder whether he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the careful control she was used to hearing from him. He asked her whether she had known, from the very first night she arrived at his gates, that the girl now sleeping down the corridor from her own rooms was destined to kill him, and whether her initial pursuit of him had been built on the knowledge of a man's death she had already read as a story before she ever met him as a person. Rosalind told him yes, because there was no version of the truth that made the answer anything else, and because she had promised herself, sitting in that same archive months earlier, that if she ever told him at all, she would tell him completely. Kale stood and told her, with a stillness more unsettling than anger would have been, that he needed time before he could decide what to do with what she had just told him. He did not accuse her of manipulation outright, but he told her that everything she had ever offered him, every proposal she had made as a joke, every piece of intelligence she had brought him, now sat differently in his memory, reframed by the knowledge that she had approached him from the beginning as a character in a story whose ending she already knew and had set out to rewrite. Rosalind did not argue the point, because she understood, watching him leave the archive without looking back, that there was nothing she could say in that moment that would make the truth easier to hold. The days that followed settled into a distance neither of them acknowledged aloud. Kale continued attending to Muriel with the same daily consistency he had shown since her rescue, and Rosalind continued her research into the temple's altered records, but the easy rhythm that had grown between them over months of shared archive work and careful arguments disappeared without either of them formally ending it. Estelle noticed the change first, asking Rosalind once, carefully, whether something had happened between her and the Emperor, and receiving only a quiet answer that some things could not be fixed by explaining them a second time. Celestine noticed as well, though she did not press for details, offering only the observation that trust broken by an old omission rarely returned through apology alone, and that time and consistent honesty tended to matter more than either party wanted to admit in the moment. Muriel, unaware of the shift between the two adults she had slowly begun to trust, continued needing both of them regardless of what remained unresolved between them, and it was in the quiet, shared obligation of caring for her that Rosalind and Kale continued to occupy the same rooms without occupying the same closeness they had before. Rosalind told herself this was enough for now, that protecting Muriel mattered more than whatever had broken between them in the archive, and that whatever came next between her and Kale would have to wait until the more immediate danger, still gathering somewhere beyond the palace walls, had been dealt with first. She did not yet know that Severian's next move would force the question of trust between them into the open again far sooner than either of them expected. Severian understood, after losing the council vote over Muriel's custody, that legitimate institutional pressure inside the palace had stopped working in his favor. Elias, still quietly monitoring temple correspondence through contacts loyal to him rather than to Severian, intercepted a coded exchange between the temple and an errant courier within the month, revealing that Severian had opened direct communication with Queen Marcella. The correspondence offered temple support, both financial and magical, for a coordinated uprising intended to weaken Kale's authority enough to force renewed border negotiations, with the rent recovering territory lost in the earlier war as the price of its cooperation. Rosalind read the intercepted letters herself, recognizing her mother's formal phrasing even through the coded text, and found her brother Adrian's seal alongside Marcella's on a separate document outlining troop movements meant to coincide with unrest the temple intended to stir inside the capital. She brought the evidence to Kale directly, their first substantive conversation since the archive 3 weeks earlier, delivered with the same clinical precision she used for every piece of intelligence rather than any attempt to use the moment to repair what remained unresolved between them. Kale received the information with the same controlled distance he had maintained since her confession, thanking her for the report without commenting on anything beyond its content. Severian, aware that his correspondence carried risk of discovery, moved to secure his position by discrediting the one person capable of reading his letters as easily as she had read the altered prophecy. Temple sermons across the capital shifted within days from cautious concern about Muriel's instability to direct accusation against Rosalind herself, describing her as a foreign witch who had used forbidden influence to corrupt the emperor's judgment, manufacture false evidence against loyal clergy, and orchestrate what the sermons now openly called the kidnapping of an innocent child from proper spiritual care. The accusations spread through the city faster than any counterstatement the palace could issue, feeding on existing unease about a hostage princess who had publicly declared intent to marry the emperor before ever proving her loyalty to anyone. Adrian arrived at the palace under diplomatic cover 11 days later, requesting a private audience with his sister rather than any formal meeting with the imperial household. He told Rosalind, once they were alone, that their mother's rebellion was set to begin within the month, coordinated with temple unrest already spreading through the capital, and that he had finally decided to warn her rather than continue serving as their mother's obedient instrument. Rosalind asked him, without softening the question, why he had waited until 11 days before the uprising to say anything, when he had clearly known enough to warn her much earlier. Adrian admitted he had hoped, for longer than he could defend, that some other resolution would make the choice between his mother and his sister unnecessary. Rosalind told him that hope had cost her the ability to prepare properly, and that whatever gratitude she might once have felt for a warning delivered in time now competed directly with the knowledge that he had watched their mother plan an uprising against the empire she had chosen to protect for weeks before deciding she was worth the risk of speaking. Adrian did not defend himself further, only confirmed the rebellion's rough timeline and the temple's role in coordinating unrest inside the capital before returning to his own retinue. Rosalind watched him leave without the closeness that had once defined their relationship, understanding that his warning, however useful, had not restored what his silence had already cost. She brought Adrian's information directly to Kale, delivered alongside Elias's intercepted correspondence as corroborating proof, and the two pieces of evidence together left no reasonable doubt that Severian intended to use both a foreign rebellion and manufactured public outrage against Rosalind as simultaneous cover for whatever he planned next. Kale ordered increased security throughout the capital and instructed Theo to quietly identify which temple factions remained loyal to the throne rather than to Severian personally, but he did not yet move publicly against the Grand Oracle, aware that open accusation without complete proof would only validate Severian's narrative of a paranoid emperor manipulated by a foreign witch. Celestine reached her own limit 3 days after Adrian's visit, having watched Severian's sermons grow more inflammatory with each passing day, and having spent the same period quietly compiling evidence of her own from records she had access to as the temple's chosen saintess. She called for a public audience before the assembled court, an unusual request from a saintess that drew immediate attention, and used the platform to formally renounce her position as Severian's chosen bride for the emperor, stating plainly that she would not lend her office to a marriage built on a forged prophecy or to a temple willing to imprison and torment a child to preserve its own authority. Celestine did not stop at renunciation. She produced records she had gathered over years of quiet investigation, documenting the disappearance of at least 4 previous saintesses whose public roles had ended in sudden, unexplained retirements, alongside evidence connecting two scholars who had died in what were officially ruled accidents to research they had conducted into lunar magic shortly before their deaths. She described, without theatrical embellishment, a pattern of children with unstable magical potential quietly disappearing into custodial monasteries under circumstances matching what Muriel had suffered, framing the temple's treatment of Kale's niece not as an isolated failure but as one documented instance of a practice Severian had maintained for years. The court, already unsettled by Severian's accusations against Rosalind, now had to reconcile those accusations against the saintess's own sworn testimony delivered from inside the institution, making them. Severian, cornered by Celestine's public testimony and aware that the palace was closing in on his correspondence with Arendt, moved his timeline forward rather than abandon it. He announced that the temple would proceed, as scheduled, with the decennial rite of renewal, a ceremony requiring the emperor to publicly reaffirm the founding oaths of his reign before the assembled court inside the coronation hall, framing any imperial refusal to attend as further proof of a ruler abandoning tradition under a foreign witch's influence. Kale understood the ceremony was almost certainly the moment Severian intended to act, but refusing to attend risked confirming exactly the narrative Severian had built, and cancelling it outright would hand the temple grounds to claim the throne itself had broken faith with the empire's founding. While Kale prepared for the ceremony, Rosalind pursued the one piece of evidence she still lacked: proof of what the missing clause in the marriage prophecy had actually said. Elias, drawing on fragments he had preserved over months of quiet work, identified a sealed lower chamber beneath the temple's main archive, built into the original foundation and referenced only obliquely in construction records predating Severian's tenure as Grand Oracle. Rosalind and Elias descended into the chamber the night before the rite, working quickly under borrowed lamplight, and found the original, unaltered prophecy sealed inside a stone reliquary that had clearly not been opened in decades. The unaltered text described a future considerably more conditional than the version Severian had circulated for years. It stated plainly that the emperor's daughter carried power capable of destroying the empire only if the emperor, faced with the choice between his crown and her life, chose to sacrifice her to preserve his throne. The betrayal itself, not the child's power alone, was what the prophecy identified as the true danger, a single catastrophic act of abandonment that would corrupt her magic beyond recovery and turn grief into destruction. Rosalind read the passage twice, understanding immediately why Severian had removed it. A prophecy warning rulers against sacrificing their own children offered him no leverage, but a prophecy that simply declared the child dangerous gave him every justification he needed to control her, and eventually to use her, however he chose. The coronation hall filled the next morning with the full assembled court, alongside temple clergy and a heavier than usual presence of armed attendants Kale's own security officers had not authorized. Theo noticed the discrepancy too late to act on it discreetly. The moment Kale began the ceremonial oath, armed men positioned among the temple's honor guard moved on his signal, and the hall dissolved into open confrontation between imperial soldiers and conspirators loyal to Severian. Duke Lucan's forces held the entrances, but the chaos inside the hall gave Severian exactly the cover he needed to reach Muriel, seated near the dais as protocol required for the emperor's heir. Severian pressed a small mark token against Muriel's shoulder before Theo could intervene, a device Elias later confirmed had been designed years earlier to trigger the corrupted lunar magic the temple had spent 6 years cultivating in her. Muriel's power surged outward without her willing it, a spreading cold light that cracked stone pillars and sent nobles scrambling from the hall, and beneath the light Rosalind could see something moving that was not simply magic but a presence the light seemed to be feeding rather than merely expressing. Kale reached his niece's side within seconds, but the entity's surge continued growing regardless of his presence, feeding on the terror spreading through the collapsing hall. Kale invoked the crown sigil, the inherited mark binding Verdun rulers to magically enforceable authority, attempting to use its power to contain the entity now surfacing through Muriel. The sigil answered his call, but not cleanly. Every corrupted oath Severian had layered into it over years of manipulated ceremonies answered alongside the genuine ones, and the false obligations bound into his own authority turned against him the moment he tried to exercise it at full strength. Kale staggered as the sigil's light burned across his chest, the accumulated weight of oaths he had never freely chosen tearing at him even as he fought to hold the containment steady around Muriel. Rosalind reached the hall moments later, pushing through retreating nobles with the unsealed prophecy still in hand, and found Duke Lucan and 2 senior ministers already urging Kale toward the one solution the original, corrupted version of the prophecy had always implied was available, that ending Muriel's life immediately would collapse the entity's surge and end the coup before it could spread further into the capital. Lucan did not speak the suggestion cruelly, only urgently, as a commander calculating the fastest path to stopping mass casualties, and one of the ministers added that the Empire's survival could not depend on a single child's safety when thousands stood at risk in the collapsing hall. Kale, visibly weakening under the sigil's punishing feedback, did not answer them immediately. Rosalind reached him and thrust the unsealed prophecy into his hands, telling him rapidly what it actually said, that the destruction the temple had always warned of was never Muriel's power acting alone, but the specific betrayal of an emperor choosing his crown over her life, and that killing her now would not prevent the catastrophe the original text described, it would cause it. Kale read enough of the passage to understand what she was telling him even through the pain visibly radiating from the sigil's corrupted weight, and turned to Lucan and the assembled ministers to give them his answer. He told them, in a voice strained but entirely certain, that he would not sacrifice his daughter to save his crown, whatever the sigil's damage cost him personally, and that any minister who believed the Empire's survival required a 7-year-old's death had misunderstood exactly what kind of empire was worth surviving for. Lucan did not argue further, though his expression made clear he believed the choice might cost them everything. Kale turned back toward Muriel, the entity's light still spreading around her small, frightened form, and forced himself, despite the sigil's damage tearing through him with every use of his power, to move closer rather than away. Kale crossed the last distance to Muriel without raising the sigil against her directly, letting its remaining strength hold only a narrow containment around the spreading light rather than attempting to force it closed by will alone. He knelt at the edge of the cold radiance, close enough that the light licked at his sleeves, and told her plainly, over the sound of the collapsing hall, that he had not come to stop her the way the temple had trained her to expect. He told her he had come because she was his daughter, and that whatever was moving through her right now, he intended to stay beside her through it rather than end it by ending her. Rosalind reached them a moment later, ignoring Theo's shouted warning to stay back, and knelt on Muriel's other side, keeping her hands visibly open and still exactly as she had the first day in the monastery. She told Muriel, as steadily as she could manage, that she had promised months ago never to force her to use or suppress her power, and that the promise still held even now, even with the entire hall in danger, because breaking it now would prove every fear the temple had ever taught her correct. She did not tell Muriel to fight the entity or to stop the light. She told her only that they were both still there, and that they were not leaving. Muriel, somewhere inside the spreading cold light, heard them the way a drowning person hears a voice from the shore, distant but undeniably present. The entity's pull had always fed on the certainty that she would eventually be abandoned or destroyed by the people meant to protect her, a certainty the temple had spent 6 years carefully constructing inside her through every punishment and every isolation. Kale's refusal to raise a weapon against her, and Rosalind's refusal to demand anything from her even now, offered the entity nothing to feed on that matched the pattern it had been built to exploit. For the first time since Severian's token had touched her shoulder, Muriel made a choice rather than simply reacting to fear, and the choice was to push the presence away rather than let it keep speaking through her. The rejection did not happen gently. The light convulsed rather than faded, throwing Kale and Rosalind back several feet as the entity's connection to its host tore loose all at once rather than unraveling slowly, and for a moment the hall filled with a pressure that made every remaining pillar groan under its weight. Then, as suddenly as it had surged, the light collapsed inward and vanished, leaving Muriel collapsed and shaking on the dais floor, drained but entirely herself, no longer host to anything but her own exhausted body. The backlash from the severed connection did not simply disappear. Severian, standing near the hall's far entrance where he had directed the coup, staggered as the magical contract binding the entity to his control violently reversed itself, the corrupted binding he had built without the consent the world's own laws of magic required finally collapsing under its own instability. A contract sustained only by force and concealment rather than genuine agreement had never been stable to begin with, and the sudden severing of its intended host sent the full weight of its collected power flooding back through the only remaining anchor, Severian himself. He fell where he stood, the temple's own honor guard scattering rather than approaching a man whose body was visibly unraveling under power he could no longer control. Duke Lucan's forces secured the hall within the hour, capturing the surviving conspirators among the temple's honor guard and confirming, through documents recovered from Severian's own quarters that evening, direct coordination with Queen Marcella's rebellion and troop movements planned to coincide with the coup's aftermath. Word reached Durant's border garrisons before they could fully mobilize, and the uprising collapsed within days without its temple-backed cover, leaving Queen Marcella publicly exposed as having conspired against the Empire holding her daughter hostage. Prince Adrian, having already warned Rosalind before the coup began, distanced himself from his mother's remaining supporters as quickly as the political situation allowed, though the distance did little to repair what his earlier silence had already cost. Cale did not fully recover from the sigil's damage in the days that followed. The physicians who examined him confirmed that the corrupted oaths, though severed from Severian's control, had burned through enough of the crown's sigil's inherited power that its remaining strength would never return to what it had been before the coup. Cale received the report with the same flat composure Rosalind had come to recognize as his way of absorbing bad news before deciding what to do about it, telling his physicians only that an emperor who could no longer rule through magically enforced authority alone would simply need to learn to rule through other means. In the weeks that followed, the full evidence of Severian's crimes, combined with Celestine's testimony and the coup's undeniable failure, left the Temple of the Twin Lights unable to defend its former position within imperial governance. The Council, no longer able to treat the temple as a stabilizing institution rather than the source of the Empire's recent crisis, began stripping its formal authority over coronation rites, magical education, and the certification of healers, a process that would take years rather than weeks to fully complete. The capital settled into an uneasy period of reform and reckoning, with noble families realigning their loyalties and temple factions splintering between those implicated in Severian's schemes and those, like Brother Elias, who had worked quietly against them. Muriel slept for most of 2 days following the coup, and when she woke, the first thing she asked Rosalind, in a voice still hoarse from exhaustion, was whether she was in trouble for what had happened in the hall. Cale found Rosalind 3 nights after the coup, still recovering from the sigil's damage but steady enough to walk unassisted, and asked her to marry him in the same private study where he had once refused her publicly. He told her plainly that watching Muriel collapse and knowing he might lose them both in the same afternoon had made clear to him what he wanted, and that he did not intend to spend any more time pretending uncertainty he no longer felt. Rosalind wanted, badly, to say yes. Instead, she told him she could not accept a proposal made 3 days after nearly losing everyone he loved, because she needed to know the answer would still be the same once the fear had faded, not only while it was still raw enough to make the choice feel urgent. Cale did not argue with her reasoning, though the refusal visibly cost him something to accept. The months that followed brought no single dramatic reconciliation between them, only a slow accumulation of ordinary consistency either of them tried to rush. Rosalind continued working alongside Elias and Celestine to catalogue the full extent of the temple's altered records, testimony that proved essential as the council debated exactly how much of its authority the temple should be permitted to retain. Cale relearned the mechanics of governing without leaning on the crown sigil's diminished power, relying instead on Lucan's military standing, the council's slowly rebuilding trust, and increasingly, on Rosalind's counsel during policy sessions he no longer pretended not to value. Neither of them raised the archived confession again directly, but each small decision to trust the other's honesty, repeated often enough over those months, did more to repair what had broken between them than any single apology could have. Word reached the palace that autumn that Queen Marcella had been formally stripped of her authority over Rent's Regency Council following the collapse of her temple-backed rebellion, and that Prince Adrian had assumed the throne in her place with the council's support. Adrian sent Rosalind a formal letter announcing his coronation, written with none of the coded urgency of his earlier warnings, and Rosalind answered it with equal formality, congratulating her brother on his new position without inviting any deeper reconciliation either of them was ready to attempt. Their correspondence in the following years remained respectful and occasionally useful to both kingdoms, but it never recovered the closeness that had existed before Adrian chose, for too long, to protect their mother's plans rather than his sister. Celestine, freed from her expected role as Cale's bride, spent the following year working with reform-minded clergy and independent healers to establish a new institution outside temple control, dedicated to training healers and magical scholars under standards that did not depend on the Temple of the Twin Lights certification. Cale granted the institution imperial charter and funding once its founding structure was complete, recognizing it as the clearest path towards separating magical education from the kind of concentrated, unaccountable authority Severian had spent decades building. Celestine visited the palace regularly afterward, less as a political figure than as a friend to both Cale and Rosalind, and eventually became one of the few people permitted to see Miriel during her early, cautious sessions studying the safe use of her own lunar magic. Miriel's recovery moved slowly and without any single turning point either Cale or Rosalind could point to as the moment she stopped flinching at raised voices or unfamiliar footsteps. She continued sleeping poorly for months, continued needing reassurance that neither of them was disappearing, and continued treating any request to demonstrate her power with quiet wariness even as the requests themselves stopped resembling anything the temple had once demanded of her. What changed gradually was how much of the day she spent without visibly bracing for something to go wrong, and how often she sought Rosalind out directly rather than waiting to be found. On a quiet afternoon nearly a year after the coup, helping Rosalind sort through archive records either of them strictly needed to be sorting, Miriel asked, without any particular ceremony, whether it would be acceptable to call her mother instead of only by her name. Rosalind told her that it would be more than acceptable, and Miriel, satisfied, went back to sorting the records as though she had not just changed something significant between them. Miriel continued, in the years that followed, to keep a small shrine in her rooms honoring her birth parents, visiting it privately on the anniversary of their deaths and asking Cale, each year, to tell her something new about the brother he had lost. Cale always found something, even when the search took him longer than he admitted, understanding that Miriel choosing to call Rosalind her mother had never required her to set aside the parents she had never truly known, only to accept that grief and new belonging could exist in the same life without canceling each other out. Cale proposed to Rosalind again a little over a year after the coup, on an ordinary evening with no ceremony arranged and no crisis pressing at either of them. He told her simply that he wanted to marry her, not because any prophecy required it, not because any political alliance depended on it, and not because any oath bound him to it, but because he could not imagine building the rest of his reign, or the rest of Miriel's childhood, without her beside him by his own free choice. Rosalind accepted before he had entirely finished speaking, telling him that he had finally asked the only version of the question she had ever actually wanted answered. Their wedding, held the following spring, was deliberately built without any of the magically binding vows traditionally woven into imperial marriages, a choice Cale insisted on personally after everything the crown sigil's false obligations had cost him. Miriel stood beside them during the ceremony, older now by more than a year and steadier on her feet than the frightened child pulled from a monastery cell, and Duke Lucan, who had once argued for her return to temple custody, stood as one of her witnesses, having spent the intervening months earning back, however slowly, the trust his earlier caution had cost him. Several years later, the empire Rosalind had once feared destined for ruin looked considerably different from the one she remembered from a novel written by someone who had never lived inside it. The Temple of the Twin Lights survived in a much reduced form, its authority over imperial law, magical certification, and coronation ritual permanently dissolved by reforms the Council had spent years implementing, while Celestine's independent institution had become the Empire's primary center for training healers and magical scholars. Miriel, well into her studies as a young scholar specializing in the safe cultivation of lunar magic, was no longer spoken of in the capital as anything resembling a villainess, Historians and common citizens alike had come to know her instead as the imperial princess whose rescue had exposed the corruption at the heart of the old temple order, and whose recovery had helped rebuild an institution meant, for the first time, to protect children like her rather than exploit them. Rosalind, watching her daughter argue confidently with visiting scholars twice her age over the proper handling of an unstable lunar sample, found it difficult to remember the version of the future she had once memorized from a book, and found that she did not miss it at all.